All right. So last week we talked about morality, and let's see, where's my thing? Here we go. We talked about morality. We talked about morality from the point of view of happiness, that God's laws are not just arbitrary rules that he imposes upon us, but instead they're all about guiding us towards happiness. And we talked some about the Ten Commandments. I gave you the handout last time. I didn't print more this time, so if you happen to have it with you. The handout on the Ten Commandments, and I mentioned too, if there are any, that you're welcome to look through it yourself, and if there's any kind of areas in there that you wanted me to talk about more during RCIA, we could incorporate that in. Otherwise, I've got some specific areas that we're going to talk about in here. But as we go through on that handout, we have the Ten Commandments. I have them split up, that the first 3 commandments are all about love of God, and then the last 4 through 10 are about love of neighbor. So, and each of these commandments are more than just what we see in each of these lines here. So the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have strange gods before me. We see on here that what we are to do is to have the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity towards God. And there are various sins against faith, hope, and charity that fall under this category. So, for example, a sin against charity would be something like indifference. So we neglect or refuse to make the faith an important part of our life. So we're basically like, I don't care about all that religion stuff, and so we just don't spend any time even thinking about it. That would be a sin of indifference, a sin against God's charity, his love for us. A lack of gratitude would fall under that as well. So other things that we should do is the virtue of religion. So that is our prayerful actions of offering God praise, honor, and atonement. So who God is, he deserves to receive something from us. He deserves our praise and honor. And if we fail to do those things, then that would fall under this commandment of honoring God in this way. So, or replacing God with something else. That's why things like idolatry. So idolatry is all about making some other thing out to be God, right? That's what adultery is all about. Replacing God with something else, right? No, that's a strange God. So that's very clear in this one. But things like superstitious practices, where we place our trust in some kind of action, or like, well, if I do this or if I say this, then good things will happen. That's why Catholics shouldn't be using things like horoscopes or like even there's weird Catholic superstitions that we really shouldn't do. Like there's one strange superstition where you take a statue of St. Joseph and you bury him in the ground to help sell your house, right? So, praying to St. Joseph so that he would help you to sell the house is fine. But just the fact of burying a statue in the ground to do it is really kind of more a superstition than it is an actual Catholic practice. So even within Catholicism, sometimes you find people kind of distort Catholic things into superstitious type practices.
So that's a sin?
So superstition is a sin because you're placing your trust and hope in something other than, now let's say it's somebody who actually, let's say they are praying to St. Joseph, and then as part of that they decide to bury it. Well, that wouldn't necessarily be a sin. But if it's, I'm going to bury this statue, and the act of me burying it is what's going to make it happen, if that's their belief, then that's a superstitious belief and it's sinful. But if it's the fact that, well, I was told if I just pray to St. Joseph and then I also have to bury the statue, then that's not necessarily sinful, because your trust should be, it is kind of a weird thing, but a burying the statue like that, but why don't you put him up on the mantle or something so that you could remember to pray, asking for his intercession. That might be a better way to use a statue of St. Joseph. But there's sometimes those little weird things that come. Trying to use magic, like actually believing in magic and thinking that if I do these magical incantations, something will happen. That's placing your trust in something other than God. That's why a lot of occult practices are condemned by the church. They would be against this commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So this is all about showing great respect to God's name, who he is. We shouldn't use his name in disrespect. There are kind of two main levels of the way in which someone could disrespect God's name. The more severe one would be blasphemy itself, right? And that's actually uttering against God, whether aloud or interiorly, words of hatred or defiance or speaking ill will of God, and actually meaning to do so against him. Whereas cursing would be taking God's name in vain without perhaps the direct intention of being against God. So when people go about using God's name, as an expletive, that is also sinful. It probably doesn't reach the level of blasphemy if you don't have a same, if you don't intend against God, but it is serious because you're disrespecting him, because when we use his name, he shows up in a sense, right? You call upon God and he's like, all right, I'm here. And then you're like, I didn't want you. I was just mad. It's like, but that doesn't, think of doing that to your friend, right? You're mad, and so you start yelling out your friend's name, and they're like, what's wrong? And like, I don't want to talk to you. I'm just mad. Like, well, that's not very respectful, right? So the way to remedy that is that when we find ourselves using God's name or Jesus' name in that way, is to, I am sorry, Lord, that I used your name in anger or surprise or whatever, but now that you're here, here's what's going on. I need your help, right? Transform it into a kind of prayer, right? We should also confess God's name, so witness to the Lord and to our belief in him. We want to also keep promises that we make in his name. So one should not make it a habit of swearing oaths in God's name. You don't want to call upon, because if you don't keep that, then it's going to be very, very serious. We don't want to misuse God's name in that way. So like, for example, the sin, so perjury, making a promise under oath, if you don't have an intention of keeping it or you don't keep it, that is a severe sin, because that's why we even find that still in civil practice, right, where you're supposed to place your hand on scriptures or something like that, right? That would be a sin to perjure oneself because you're not keeping a promise in God's name. The third commandment is to remember to keep holy the Lord's Day. So we want to keep, the main ways in which we do this is to keep the Sabbath day, keep Sunday as a holy day for us as Christians. It's no for Jewish people in the Old Testament, it was Saturday. That was the day of rest, the Sabbath. But for us, it's Sunday because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. Right? So we keep the Lord's Day holy. We do so by making it a day of rest, a day of prayer, by coming to Mass. That's part of one of the laws of the church, right? To come to Mass on all Sundays and holy days of obligation. So that would be one of the ways in which we would sin against this commandment, is to choose not to go to Mass. Also, with regard to it being a day of rest, is to avoid unnecessary work. We don't want to place work above God. So it doesn't mean that in the Old Testament, some of these commandments were taken to an extreme, and so Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath because he would do good things for people on the Sabbath, and he explained that, that it being a day of rest and to honor God doesn't mean now you're exempt from doing good. So you can't say, I don't have to treat you nicely today because this is a day of rest, right? And it's a day all about God, and I don't have to pay attention to you. Well, no, you're not exempt from the other commandments just because it is a day for the Lord. So, and this can be a challenge in our world today because our society isn't designed to give a day of rest. But it's incredibly important that we do that. The Lord knows that just as he rested on the seventh day, he also knows that we need to rest, otherwise we'll drive ourselves crazy, and it'll become unhealthy for us if we don't spend. So we can do other things, set aside time for prayer, to study, learn more about the faith, to practice works of charity or mercy, to spend time with your family, those kinds of things on the Lord's Day. To honor your father and mother. So now we move on into the commands that are about loving our neighbor. This one's all about family. Marriage and family are the foundation of society. It's within family that we live our lives. And so we have various duties within this. So there's duties that parents have towards their children. So one of the duties of parents toward their children is to discipline their children. All right, so they need to do that. Also, they have a duty to instruct their children in the faith, so that they'll grow in the faith. Children also have a duties toward their parents. So they are to show respect towards their parents and obedience. Right. So not just it has to show respect. To show that you're showing respect, you actually then have to obey and do what they ask. And interestingly, these honor your father and mother, these duties between parents and children, don't, even though they change as children grow and leave the home, they're not God. So it doesn't mean, well, now I'm an adult, I don't have to honor my father and mother anymore. No, we still have obligations toward our family in this. And under this, too, is the duties to and of civil authorities. So we also have to have respect and obedience towards those that have a legitimate authority. And we are to obey them, so we need to obey the laws of the land that we live in, as long as they're reasonable laws. If authority is asking us to do something contrary to God's laws, they are no longer just laws, and we are not obliged to follow those. In fact, we can be morally obliged not to follow those and to disobey them, because they're not just laws. But what we ought to do is work to change unjust laws, if those are in that case, those exist. All right. The fifth commandment is you shall not kill. This one's all about the respect for human life, that we have respect for every human life from the moment of conception until their natural death. It's sacred because we're all made in God's image and likeness. And so there's various things. There's a whole bunch of different ones. We could have sins against our own life. So that's why suicide is, to take one's own life. You're, in a sense, playing God. Now, there can be mental circumstances that can reduce the culpability for somebody who goes through that because they're in distress. But it's contrary to God's will that we would take our own life into our hands. Only God alone has power over life and death for all of us. We could have sins against our own body. We could have sins against others, both their body and their soul. So a sin against somebody's soul, so in a sense like killing their soul, would fall the sin of scandal. So the way we use scandal is to somebody did something that scandalized us, right? And so today we might be like, well, there's some things that in the past scandalized people, and today it doesn't scandalize people anymore. Well, that doesn't mean that it isn't a scandal when they do that. Scandal means it's leading basically somebody else to believe that something isn't sinful, right? So if the world around us doesn't think a certain act is sinful, it's to basically teach another person that it's not sinful would be scandal, because it's leading their soul away from God, right? It's going to lead them to cause them to sin. That's why Jesus said this is a pretty serious thing, scandal, because he says in the scriptures, if you were to cause one of my little ones to sin, it would be better to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the sea than to scandalize my little ones and lead them into sin, right? To cause them to sin. So that's scandal. Scandal against our sins against the lives of others. So there's all sorts of different ones. Anger is in the midst of this. Anger as an emotion isn't a sin, but forms of anger can become sinful. So if we're angry at somebody over wrong things, so we're angry about something that's not just for us to be angry about, right? So I'm angry that this person did this thing, or let's say, great example is a child is angry at their parent because they won't let them do something, right? You're the mean mom or dad, right? You hate me because you won't let me do this, right? They're angry because you won't let them do something. But that's not a just anger, because they're angry because you're saying no to something because you want their good, right? So that would be unjust anger. Anger over the wrong things, right? for the wrong motives. So it's anger where you want to get back at that person. You want to see them. You want to see them suffer because they've made you suffer, right? That's not a healthy. It's not a holy anger. Anger that's too fierce, right? That can bring forth itself in various ways, like using abusive language towards others, or harboring resentment, where we want somebody else to get what's coming to them for whatever they've done to us, or the next step where we actually carry it out through revenge. Right? So those are all sinful forms of anger. But anger as an emotion itself doesn't have to necessarily be sinful, because even Jesus, you find him getting angry in the scriptures for a just reason when he throws the money changers out for using his father's house as a marketplace. So, and then there's the ones that we probably would be, things like, violence, murder, abortion. These things all fall under euthanasia, all fall under you shall not kill. We need to have respect for human life. You shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. So these is Commandment 6 and Commandment 9. So these are actually related to one another. We could look at it as though Commandment 6 is more focused on external actions with regard to sexuality, whereas 9 is more about what's going on internally. It's more is what's focused in this one. But there's a relationship between these two commandments, which is why I have them kind of together. So obviously the good parts of it we talked about with regard to marriage. And there's a lot of various sins directly against marriage, sins against the openness of life within marriage, sins against the integrity of the marriage act between husband and wife. Then under the 9th commandment, more internally, it sins against chastity. That's the virtue by which we integrate our sexuality into our whole person, moderating what's going on within it. And I'm not going to go through a lot of these here, because we're actually going to, after I finish going through the 10 commandments briefly, then we'll go into some theology of the body and look more at some of the church's teaching in the area of sexuality. So we'll come back to some of those. All right, so then the 7th and 10th commandments are also related to one another. You shall not steal, and the 10th commandment is you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. Right? So once again, these are also external and internal. Right? What we are to do is that we should have proper stewardship of what God has given to us in our world. Right? So God has given us everything as a gift. The whole world belongs to him, but we're stewards of it. So we are called to take care of it. And you can see this in the scripture where, he has stewards that take care of, he gives parables where he's talking about the good steward that takes care of, when the king's on leave, he's taking care of the goods of the steward, or the ones who have the various talents, right? That, he gave this talent to this person, and so this is what they did with that talent, right? So what are we are we being good stewards of what God has given to us? The area of caring for the environment or our common home is also part of this. Catholic, if we have time, we may get into this another time too, as to what's the proper kind of Christian understanding when it comes to environmentalism. It's not exactly the way in which secular environmentalism looks at it, but it really has respecting the world around us, the place where human life is nourished and protected and developed. And then one other thing to point out too is that we are to do is to live in a kind of simplicity of life, right? That we don't get attached internally too much to things. So that's why covetousness, so wanting what other people have for ourselves, greed, so the desire just to get more and more and more of things, or avarice, which is wanting to get more and more and more of money, or envy. That's basically one great way of putting it is envy is when good things happen to other people, something in me dies. Right? So it's an interior sadness when good things happen to others because it didn't happen to me. And so, and really a desire to, I don't want other people to get what they get because I didn't get it, right? Envy is the one sin that has no pleasure connected to it at all, except some kind of twisted pleasure of getting pleasure in the pain of others, right? It brings no, because a lot of times, Satan will, we're tempted by certain things because there's this false sense of pleasure we're going to get from it. And envy has none at all. So that's how insidious that one is. So obviously stealing things, robbery. One thing to note with regard to stealing something, if somebody steals something, that damage of stealing that needs to be repaired. And so restitution needs to be made. And so let's say you steal something, you need to return what's stolen. If you're unable to return what you stole because, let's say, you stole a food item and you ate it, well, you should attempt to make restitution by paying back in some way, whether it's to the place where it was stolen or towards a charitable organization or something, but some way making up for what you have taken. And finally, the 8th commandment is the last one. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And this one's all about the truth, right? So we are to live in the truth. We're obliged to be truthful in both our words and our actions, right? And so the truth, basically, what is truth? That was one of the questions that was asked by Pontius Pilate to Jesus. Truth is what you have in your mind matches what actually is in reality, right? So if you know what's true, what you're thinking matches actual reality. So to speak the truth, what we shouldn't do then is we shouldn't lie, deliberately saying something that we know is untrue. That's lying. And there's various forms of lying. So we can do calumny or slander. That's making up false things against somebody else, making up lies against them to destroy their reputation. Detraction. So this is, I think, an important one for people to know the name of. Detraction, that way you can name what it is. Detraction, I have on there, is hurting someone's good name through the disclosure of an incriminating truth. So basically, I know something not the greatest about that person, and I'm going to tell everybody I know about it, right? That's detraction. And that's often, that's underneath of it, I have gossip, negative commentary regarding the character of somebody, right? So often those go hand in hand, is that, I found this juicy tidbit about this person, I'm going to tell people about it. Right? This is sinful. There's no if you have no responsibility of telling this to the people you're telling, like in some cases you might actually have a responsibility, to get past it. That's one of the things too with regard to truth, is that we have to tell the truth with discretion. So not everybody has the right to every piece of information, right? And so we may at times have a duty towards silence, of not saying certain things, not lying about it, but that person doesn't have a right to know that information. That's why some people will be like, what if it's the case in, where someone is hiding the Jews and, the Nazis come knocking at the door, do you have to tell them the truth that they're hiding in your basement? It's like, no, they have no right for that information, right? So you can use a kind of mental, not to lie to them, but to use mental reservation in such a way as so that you can exclude information that they have no right to, right? So that's the same way with keeping secrets. We can be obliged to keep secrets, if the good of our neighbor demands it, right? If there's no reason to give that information, when we've promised to keep a promise, when we've made a promise to be quiet about it, then we're obliged to uphold that, or when someone's profession. Right? So like me as a priest, I certainly have many moments in which, as my professor in the seminary, one of my professors said, "Gentlemen, you are not a source of information." Right? So I'm a source of a lot of this kind of information, but not personal information when it comes to that. And it's not limited just to the confessional, but certainly that falls under that as well. So rash judgment falls under this commandment. So rash judgment is making a conclusion that questions someone's character without sufficient evidence. So this is what it means when we're talking about don't be judgmental. We're talking about rash judgment. We're not talking about, we can judge a person's external actions based upon the Ten Commandments and say that's not a good thing for you to do. Parents need to judge their children and be like, and no, this is the consequence of your bad action. You shouldn't be doing this. That's not being judgmental. But it's, I am going to judge someone without enough evidence, right? So I'm going to assume, I don't really know that person very well, but just looking at them, I know that this is how they are, right? And unfortunately, we do this all the time. We judge people for things. And that's rash judgment, and it falls under this commandment. So if we do something like detraction or calumny and we hurt someone's reputation, then once again, just like in the previous commandment, if we steal something, we need to make restitution. We need to do the same thing. So if you're going to be like, I've realized I've defamed this person's good name, you need to admit then, if this has been a public thing that's destroyed their good name, you need to make restitution by undoing this and basically saying, this wasn't true. I'm sorry that I said these those right? That is something that needs to be done. And finally, the highest witness towards the truth is martyrdom. Those are the saints that gave up their entire life to defend the truth, right? So, very quick rundown through. If you want more information about all this, I basically followed this whole outline follows the catechism. So if there's ones where you want to read a little bit more, the catechism goes through each one. Or, as I mentioned, if there's parts of this that you want me to go into more detail, we can spend more time on some of these. So, any questions as I transition over to the next presentation? There we go. All right. I think I got everything ready here. So what we're going to talk about is some. I mentioned that we're going to look more in detail with those things having to do with the 6th and 9th commandments. So we're going to look in the area of human sexuality, something we'll call the theology of the body. We're going to look in how God has created us, male and female. We've already learned about this, God's plan from the very beginning of how he's created us. But we'll be looking back at that to kind of help us understand. Because the world around us is super confused about what love is all about. Right? There's so much confusion in our world today with regard to what human relationships, what are between men and women, what sex and sexuality is all about. Nearly every TV show and advertisement and song and movie today utilizes it and often distorts it and is often so confused about it. Oftentimes it's glorified, as though that there's no possibility of any pain ever coming from this area, or people become, or the selfishness that people can have towards one another. And I think that maybe, for some it's like, are we ignoring that is a reality, that it is? It would be, there's so much confusion, so many broken hearts today. It always makes me think back to when I went to, when I was in college, we had an English class in which we were supposed to read various topics and then write papers based upon those topics. And one of the sections, we were supposed to read a bunch of these articles having to do with sexuality and different areas in that. And so you read all these things, and you're just like, well, after reading all those things, everyone's convinced that it's important, and no one has any clue what it means. That was basically what I got out of all those articles. I was like, this is super important. and no one has any idea what it is all about, right? Before we kind of get into it, we can ask the question, what are people looking for, right? What do people want with regard to human relationships? What are they seeking in the area of sexuality? Do they want committed or uncommitted? Do they want faithful or unfaithful? Do they want something that's life-giving or lifeless? Right? I think that intuitively we know what the good is that we're made for, but so many people struggle to find what they really long for, and they settle for what's less. Right? They settle for something that's not committed. They settle for something that's just temporary, that doesn't bring them life, that ends up being just what I want, to be selfish. Things that are just skin deep and don't really get down to the depths of knowing and being known. And I think it really has to do with the fact that we've been living in we're a frog living in a boiling pot of water. So there's the frog in the pot syndrome. So what it is, frogs are cold-blooded, so that if you were to bring a frog close to a pot of boiling water, they would recognize the heat and try to get away, right? But if you put a frog in the water, their body temperature adjusts to their surroundings. So if you slowly over time continue to raise the temperature of the water, they won't jump out because their body re-regulates themselves to adjust to the water. And so they would actually, if you were to do that, they would literally stay in there and allow themselves to be boiled to death, right? And so that's an image of us today with regard to sexually explicit things that are going on in our world today. We've become so desensitized to things around us. We've allowed the temperature to be slowly turned up and up and up and up and further and further and further. And then there's so many people that we just have this seriously warped understanding of who we are as men and women and what sexuality is all about, right? And we've come to accept more and more just completely distorted things, but it's killing us. We're being boiled to death like the frog in the pot, right? But there's so many people who don't know anything else. They don't know anything other than the boiling water. They don't know that from the beginning it wasn't so. Right? And that's what leads us to the theology of the body. So the theology of the body, this is where the answer to all this is right really in front of us. It's hidden in God's original design that he created and he placed into our very bodies. Our bodies and our souls, because we're both body and soul. And so this terminology, theology of the body, it wasn't necessarily coined by John Paul II, but it's referring to writings that he gave. So the good news for us is that life and sexuality wasn't always messed up. It wasn't always meant to be this way. So in the beginning, as I already mentioned, Jesus said in the beginning, all this wasn't so. This isn't what it meant to be. It wasn't meant to be this way. And so John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, so you can get an entire book. I didn't bring it with me. I forgot to bring my copy. But it's a real thick book, right? Because in there he had, in his first 6 years of being Pope, on every Wednesday he would give a catechesis, and he would be talking about this topic, about human sexuality and relationship, because he knew the world needed this at this time and needed this kind of teaching. It was based off of, classical Christian thought. It's very scriptural. So he starts with Jesus talking with the question of divorce. We'll look at here in a second. But so that's his main book. Another book that he wrote prior to that, before he was Pope, was a book called Love and Responsibility. Both of these are very difficult to read. So I don't necessarily, you're welcome to read them, but they can be very difficult. Love and Responsibility is kind of the philosophical forerunner to his theological book. But it is really good. We read Love and Responsibility in the seminary, and it's very dense, but I don't know, it was incredibly, very helpful for me. So these are kind of the main sources, the original sources for a lot of this theology of the body that we're going to go through. I'm not even close going through everything that he talks about, but just some kind of bits and pieces, as well as some of the insights of other people and the way that they've kind of, what are some analogies to help us kind of understand this in an easier way. So it's where the theology of the body comes from. So John Paul II himself starts with Jesus, and he follows the example of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 19, when he's talking about the question of divorce, the Pharisees ask him about this, and he tells them from the beginning it wasn't so. That he refers them back to God's original plan for us. Right? So from the very beginning, we learned about how God created Adam and Eve, and he created us in his image and likeness. And when they were in the garden, everything was perfect, right? There was perfect integrity of body and soul. There was no sin in using one another yet at this point. But then, of course, we know that pain and suffering comes through the free choice of Adam and Eve, and with us trying to follow our plan rather than follow God's plan. Instead of choosing what's right, we often now choose what is wrong. So this can help us to understand how we are in the world today. And so to help explain that, I've got an analogy, the piece of paper analogy. So let's see here. I forgot to... should have a blank piece of paper, but I don't. Do you have a blank piece of paper? Because I've got... You guys already know about this one. All right. I'm tethered, so I can't. Thank you. So, this is the piece of paper, which represents us, right? So, this is us from the very beginning, right? God made us perfect in his image and likeness, right? Body and soul perfectly integrated together, right? But then what happened to us? Right? We sinned and fell, and we are significantly distorted. But that's the important thing, is we're distorted, we're not destroyed. So the way God made us is not gone, but it is distorted. And so over time, if you lose that knowledge of, from the beginning, this wasn't so. This wasn't what we're supposed to be. The world around us recognizes that something isn't quite right. But if they don't know what went wrong, then there can be some reactions to this. And the first reaction, we could say, is basically, let's not talk about it. Let's just kind of pretend it's not an issue, right? Let's repress all the things that are going on and not deal with it, right? And then there was a response to that. The response was, in more modern times, was the sexual revolution, which said, wait a second, no, we can't just ignore that. Our sexuality is part of us, right? So we can't be ashamed about it. We should be able to do whatever we want, and we'll just put it out on display, right? So both of these are wrong. Neither of these are the Christian response. Both of them recognize some truth and some untruth. That's usually the way that things are. Things are distorted, right? This itself is distorted, right? So the kind of repressive type version, the truth was they recognize that not everything's right here, and it shouldn't just be put out on display, right? That not everything is good in the area of sexuality. But their response was to basically hide it. That's where they were. That's what's not correct, in the sense it was not talking about it enough. Whereas the sexual revolution, what they got correct was we can't ignore it. What they got incorrect was to assume that all of this is perfectly good, that this is the way that it should be, that there's no other way that it can be, right? That every distortion and every, messed up thing in the area with regard to sexuality is good and should be celebrated, right? That's where they went wrong, right? But Jesus offers us an alternative to both of these ways. Unfortunately, most people may only know one way or the other in the world around us. But as Christians, we are given another way. And that's what Jesus comes to do. He comes to restore what was lost, right? So Jesus comes to take our broken selves, right? In fact, the terminology that Paul uses in Romans is the redemption of our bodies. We know that all creation is groaning in labor pains, even until now. And not only that, but we ourselves have the first fruits of the Spirit, we also grow within ourselves as we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. We are waiting for Jesus to redeem even our bodies that have been messed up through the fall, right? And so Jesus comes to iron out all what's wrinkled our soul, right? To bring us back to the original. And this is where the analogy kind of breaks down, right? I can't physically take all the wrinkles out of this paper, right? But Jesus can do that with our souls, right? But even after we're Christians, we may be kind of like this, right? Even though we've received his grace and we've been forgiven of our sins, we may still struggle with temptations, including the areas having to do with sexuality. Many people have to fight a lot of sexual temptations and sins. It doesn't mean that his grace isn't working, but it's that we still need him to get deeper in and transform our hearts to follow him. But ultimately, what Jesus can do, and when we're in heaven, we will be what he intended from the beginning. In fact, more so from the beginning, because Adam and Eve were not filled with, they weren't Christian because Jesus hadn't come yet, right? So they didn't have the life of God in the same way. They weren't adopted sons and daughters in the same way as we are now. So in fact, our state is even better in the future than it was prior to the fall. That's why the church, you'll hear at Easter time, at the Easter Vigil, you'll hear as part of the Exultet, or at the beginning of Mass, "O happy fault, which gained for us so great a Redeemer," right? So in a sense, we wouldn't have had Jesus had we not fallen. It's not that this was good, but the greater good that God brought from it, the redemption that we can have. And so in order to understand the church's teaching in the area of sexuality, we need to understand, how did God make us from the beginning? What were we made for? Rather than just look at the distorted vision. If all we look at is at our distortedness, we'll never understand why the church teaches what she does in the area of sexuality. But we have to look back to the beginning. And we've already done this quite a bit, so I won't spend too much time on looking back to the beginning, but just kind of as a reminder, to remind us that we were made in God's image and likeness, that he made us, male and female, he created us. So that even so in our bodily nature, we are to image the life of God himself. And that's really where all the sacramental nature of our life as Christians comes from, that the visible things help reveal invisible things. And we talk specifically within the area of marriage, that the relationship between husband and wife within marriage is meant to be modeled after the love between Christ and the church, right? So wives are under the mission of the husband, and the husband's mission is to love as Christ loved. So the wife represents the church, and the husband represents Jesus, and so the love between Jesus and the church is supposed to be made visible. So in the area of sexuality, that's going to apply. We're going to see how that applies. Another thing that will help us is that marriage also helps to reveal the very inner life of God himself, that God is a trinity of love. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit give themselves to one another. So the Father gives himself to the Son gives his whole self back to the Father. The love between them is so real, it's a third person, the Holy Spirit. Same thing within marriage and family. The husband gives his self fully to the wife. She gives herself back to him. And the love between them is so real, it can bring forth the new life of another person, their children. Right? So love, children is also a part we've seen with regard to marriage. We talked with regard to marriage that there's two ends, two purposes for marriage, and that's the unitive and procreative. So two will become one, that their love will be modeled after the union of God's love itself, and procreative, that it has to be life-giving, that it brings forth new potential of new life, not only for the couple, but of potential children as well. So all these kinds of things are based upon the theology, the way God made us from the very beginning, right? And in order to understand the church's teaching with regard to sexual-related morality, we have to go back to the beginning and understand that first. So we've seen a lot of this already. In the midst of this, one thing that can help us as well when we're reflecting upon these various issues is to consider both what is love and the opposite of love, right? So we'll be investigating love. First, when I ask what's the opposite of love, what would you think? What's the opposite of love? Hate, right? That's what we usually think of, right? But that's not incorrect, but it's incomplete. because to think of love versus hate, we're thinking of it primarily upon the level of emotion, right? We're thinking of it in terms of primarily emotion. But that's not the fullness of what love is all about. Love is more than an emotion. We'll see that love is a choice. It's a choice for the good for somebody else. And so we'll find that the opposite of love, John Paul II says, the opposite of love is not hate, it's use. To use another person. And so we'll kind of flesh that out here in a little bit. So, first let's do a little bit of philosophy and just kind of think about what love is, right? Destroy all the, no. Think a little bit more about love. And on a couple different levels, right? So human interaction will often begin on the level of attraction, right? So love kind of could begin as attraction, right? So here we got the guy he notices the girl, and he notices that there's something good about her, right? Hopefully it's not just the externals. Hopefully he recognizes inner beauty as well, right? But he's noticing that she is good, right? So he's attracted to good, right? We're attracted to good things, right? So that's how, and this is not a bad thing at all. I mean, God has made us this way to have an attraction, right? Is this love yet? No, this is not yet love, right? Though sometimes people will be fooled into thinking that attraction is love. It's not. The next step then is, so he recognizes a good in her, he sees her as good, and he wants that good for himself, right? That's what desire is, right? I notice a good, I want the good for myself, right? Is that love? No, that's not yet love, but it's kind of a step. That's a part of it. It's not necessarily bad, but it can turn into something bad, right? If it stays at that level, right? And sometimes people can think that, that's become love. I desire something. It's not yet. But then the next level is love as goodwill. So now he has recognized there's something good in her, and he desires that good. But then the next step is, I want good for her. I want what is good for her, right? That is much more. I choose, I want the good for somebody else. Now that is much closer to love. There's only one thing missing yet from that equation for it to be the fullness of love, and that is reciprocity. So it needs to be reciprocal, right? So the girl also must see the good in him, desire that good, and then they both must desire the good for one another above themselves. And that's when it matures into what love is all about. So John Paul II said, love is not a mere feeling, it is the act of the will that persistently prefers the good of the other over the good of oneself. That's what love is. And in this, the Church teaches in the Second Vatican Council documents that man can fully discover his true self only in a sincere gift of himself, right? We find what we're made for when we give ourselves away, right? And and we fundamentally, marriage is one of these beautiful moments where we see this lived out, right? That's what marriage is meant to be. So that means if love is putting the good of the other person above yourself, that should make more sense that the opposite of this is use. Using the person for what I can get from them, right? Because it's staying on that initial level, right? I'm seeing the good in them, and I want that good. But what starts out as desire can remain, and it can turn into use if it stays at that level, and it doesn't turn into wanting the good for the other person. And we are not to ever use another person. We can use things, but we can't use people. So we are to love people and not things, and use things and not people, right? But sometimes this is what happens in human relationships, right? Where we treat each other not with love, but we treat them as a means to something else. I'm using you to get something else, So friends are not friends if they're using you to get something else from you, right? But how often does this happen when we're using somebody? It can happen quite a bit. But that ultimately isn't love. and that kind of a relationship ultimately isn't going to last. It's going to fall apart. It's going to be destructive towards one or both of them, towards each other. So, love is willing their good, willing the good of somebody else, and the opposite of that is to use them. Right? So, when we go through when we evaluate various things, various kind of examples of proposed, here's some kind of way of using our sexuality, we could evaluate it. Is this an example of willing the other person's good, or is it an example of using the other person? Right? So that's one way which we can evaluate them. Right? But these kind of ideas that John Paul II does, it actually, a lot of these kind of ideas are deeper than just sexuality. Right? So we may call it theology of the body, and some people will describe it's all about sexuality. Well, it actually the principles behind it are actually much more fundamental. And so some of these principles can be taught even early on. So there actually are some resources, Theology of the Body for Tots. Obviously in ages 2 and 5, you're not talking about anything having to do with sexuality. But you can help them begin to understand certain things about who they are, right? Of how they've been made and of how God made them, right? So they can begin to do that. And that's what these kind of books are all about, to teach them those kinds of things, So like God made us to, every body is a gift. God made us to love, right? To show how we use our bodies to express love, right? That we can use our bodies to express love. Of course, that means we can also use our bodies not to express love, right? And so we can teach our children that, the way you're using your body, what you're doing can express love or not express love, right? If you give mom or dad a hug, you're expressing love. If you give a temper tantrum, you're not expressing love through that, everybody has a body. God made boys and girls. So to begin to help them boys and girls aren't the same. They're different in different ways. Everybody is smart. So what this does is, like, sometimes our body wants certain things, like we have certain, impulses and desires, but it teaches us that sometimes we listen to our body immediately, and other times it's not good for us to listen to our body immediately, right? That we should wait, to be patient, and then on the next level, there's a group of books too for the next age level of kids too, to help also be able to understand some of those similar kind of things. We'll look a little bit more at the middle book here in a little bit, because the middle one really can help with a concept from the theology of the body called the language of the body. And this is something that can help us also understand how we use our body as well. That our bodies can speak a language even if we're not saying anything out loud. Right? So, like, for example, none of you are talking right now, but as I look at you, you're speaking to me in some way or other, right? By facial expressions, by the way your body is, so you say things to me, right? Sometimes maybe that's the only way we can, teens will tell us anything, right? No. It's through their body expressions, but, using gestures and things like that, right? Our body has a language. That's why memes are so funny at times, because we have a image, a body, a visible thing connected to words that make it humorous, right? Even though the bodies are saying just as much as the words, right? So we use our bodies to speak, and they can be used to express what's going on within us, right? And hopefully, we learned from, when we went through the Ten Commandments just a little bit ago, that they should be expressing what's true, right? So we should express what's true. And interestingly, the thing is that, this could really fall under kind of a meditation of that, of thou shalt not bear false witness. So with regard to truth, I kind of mentioned earlier what truth is. That's the question that's proposed to Jesus. What is truth? Truth we can refer to as being objective. Objective meaning it's an object outside of who we are and what we think, right? So subjective means it's based upon the mind of a subject. of what we're thinking. But objective means reality is regardless of how we think or feel about it. It is what it is. We can't change it because it's true. I don't know if we talked about truth in previous ones because it's an important thing to think about. But there's a wonderful definition of truth that comes from Aristotle. And so even though Aristotle wasn't Christian, he had some good philosophy and good principles. So his definition of truth is this: if a man says of what is that it is, or if a man says of what is not that it is not, then he speaks the truth. But if a man says of what is that it is not, or if a man says of what is not that it is, then he does not speak the truth. Did you follow that? So they're all words of one syllable, right? Yeah, so if a man says of what is that it is, he speaks the truth. If he says of what is not that it is not, then he speaks the truth. But if he says of what is that it is not, then he doesn't speak the truth, right? So you see, very simple words, but you're right. Yeah, you gotta okay. But there's no room for well, what do those words mean? When we really kind of break it down. So saying it like it is, right? If what's in our mind matches what actually is out there in reality, then we're speaking the truth. So what we want to do is we need to speak the truth with our words, but also with our bodies, right? The truth about our body, and how is that determined? It's objective. It's not subjective. Who we are as human beings was determined by God, right? As we've already been looking at, right? God is the one who created us. None of us created ourselves, right? And so I say it's if you want to be able to determine morality for yourself, you would have had to create yourself out of nothing. And how many of you have done that? None of us have created ourselves out of nothing, right? Even though there's plenty of people today who want to create themselves into something else other than what God has created them. And that's oftentimes where they go wrong and they'll end up making themselves unhappy. The truth about our bodies reveals to us in a visible way who we are, that we're made male and female. Our bodies reveal that we're different in those ways, and that we have a spiritual soul, right? Not everybody reveals that. Here is a body, for example, that doesn't reveal a person, right? There's no person there. And our bodies reveal that we can only be treated with love, that we can only will the good of another. We're not to use them, right? That's what our bodies are meant to reveal. And so these kinds of, on the earlier level, this is something that children can learn, right? About that our body speaks a language, right? So here's some example from that book. Bodies talk and bodies listen. Everybody has something to say. My body talks. It tells me all kinds of things. My pounding heart tells me when I'm scared of the dark. My burning knee tells me I'm hurt, right? So all sorts of things in our bodily that tells us certain things, right? Tells us what's going on. Bodies talk and bodies listen. Everybody has something to say. I listen to my body, but I think about what I hear. What is my body saying? Sometimes I do what my body tells me right away. Other times I decide it's better to wait. I'm hungry, but I can choose to eat later because dinner time is soon, and I don't want to spoil my appetite, right? So begin to teach them. It's our body might say we might have a certain impulse or thing that we want to do, but we can choose to hold off, right? We don't have to, I'm hungry during the school day, so I'm going to run out of the classroom right away and go find some food. Well, no, you can choose to wait till lunchtime. So these are things, and this has nothing to do with sexuality, but yet it does. We can see how this will apply to our sexual desires when we get to the point in our growth when we're ready to learn about those things, right? And so we do have those kinds of resources as well, where we have these foundational principles that they've produced for resources for middle school or high school to get them ready. And then, of course, we have the full, there's plenty of adult books for us to assist us to do that as well. So looking back at so then we have the language of the body. We can apply that then directly to the body in the area of sexuality, right? The act of having sex. What does that bodily action mean? What does it mean? So what does the act of intercourse say? What does it mean? And as we already saw, our bodies we didn't create our own bodies, right? And so that action, we don't get to decide what it means. Instead, God is the one who's placed within our bodies its meaning, right? So what does it mean? What it's meant to say to the husband and wife is that I give my whole self to you. I give you all that I have, all that I am. I'm giving my whole self to you. That's what the action represents. That's what it makes visible. It makes visible the fact that they've given their whole selves to one another. It's a total gift of their spouses, bodily to one another, out of love for each other. It witnesses to the truth that they are united in marriage. In fact, the church will refer to it as a renewal of their wedding vows. Right? Because in their wedding vows, they gave their whole selves to each other verbally, and now when they come together as a married couple, they are expressing that with their whole bodies to one another. Right? So that's what's going on. They're renewing their wedding vows. Right? And so let's remember, with regard to the wedding vows, the promises, and the questions that they answer affirmative to, that their love is meant to be modeled after God's love. So we saw this when we talked about marriage, that marriage is meant to be free, it's meant to be total, it's meant to be faithful, and it's meant to be fruitful, to be life-giving to them. And so the action when in the areas of sexuality is meant to be modeled after God's love. And so we can once again evaluate various kinds of actions with the use of sexuality against this meaning that it's meant to have. It's meant to express the very love of God himself. It's meant to be, as I said already, a renewal of the wedding vows. That's what it's meant to say. But, unfortunately, many people will try to say other things. But if you try to say, but you can't change the meaning. And so what ends up happening is instead of speaking a truth, they will end up speaking a lie through the language of their bodies. All right? So we can speak truth with our body, or we could speak a lie through our bodies. And so all these things these are all things that are helping to prepare us so that we can evaluate various things. So for example, I've got my truth or lie chart here. I didn't make copies of this for everybody, but we could evaluate various different things with regard to, is it free, total, faithful, fruitful? Is it telling the truth or a lie? Through that. And we could also evaluate it, is it love or use? Right? And so those are all different ways in which we can evaluate if this is going to be a moral thing for somebody to do or not. Right? So if we just look at the first one flesh union within marriage, husband and wife coming together, expressing, is it free? They've chosen to get married, right? They're free. Is it total? They're giving their whole self to one another. Is it faithful? They've made their vows, right? They've promised to be faithful. Is it fruitful? Yes, it can be open to the gift of new life. So therefore, are they speaking what is true, or they lie to each other? True. They're speaking what is true to one another, right? Because they're giving their entire self. It's a promise of lifelong fidelity. They're renewing the wedding vows that are there present, right? So we can then begin to do this to all these other areas too, to begin to evaluate it, right? So let's look at adultery.
Father, can you marry someone that they say they plan on having no children?
That would invalidate a Catholic wedding, yeah. It would invalidate it, yeah. Doesn't mean that the couple will have children. Or say, for example, it's a couple that are older in age and the possibility of them having children is probably non-existent. What is required is the openness, even if we know it will not happen. But yeah, if a couple comes and want to get married, they misunderstand what marriage is, because the ends of marriage are unitive and procreative, right? Those are the ends, and we'll see as we evaluate some of these things that comes into play, yeah, of why the church says some of these areas are not moral. So if we look at adultery, so somebody who is married to somebody else is having relations with somebody they're not married with, right? Is this free?
No.
Why not?
If you're sneaking around.
And they already made a vow to somebody else, right? So they're not free to engage in this with another person. Is it total?
No.
Why not? Yeah, well, they have already made a vow to somebody else, right? So they can't give their whole self to somebody else now, right? Yeah. Is it faithful?
No.
By its very nature, it's being unfaithful to the vows they made, right? By its very nature. Is it fruitful?
No. Could be.
Probably not. Most in cases, they're probably ensuring that it's not fruitful. And it's certainly not fruitful for their lives, you know. So is it a truth or a lie through their bodies when they engage in this? Lie. They're telling a lie because their action is supposed to be saying, I'm renewing my wedding vows, but there aren't any wedding vows present there between those individuals. So it is a lie. So is this willing the good of another person or using them?
Using them.
Yeah, they're using one another, right? They're using each other. So in this case, every single one of those is very clear that each of those are being broken. And so is it any surprise that the church says this is immoral? Makes perfect sense, right? It fails on all those accounts, right? That's an easy one, right? So we start with an easy one to see. What about individuals engaging in sex outside of marriage? So think of those various characteristics. What might be missing?
The vows.
There's no vows, so therefore, so is it free? Maybe. I mean, but oftentimes there can be some pressure from one to the other, you know, outside of marriage. Is it total? They're giving their whole selves to each other. No, there was no commitment to give their whole selves to each other yet, right? So it's not total. Are they being faithful? No. At best, there could be some potential partialness there if they're exclusive, but there's no commitment between them to be faithful. So therefore, it doesn't fall into that either. Is it fruitful? Could be. But most of the time, once again, they're probably ensuring that it's not fruitful, right?
But isn't that in itself depending on the contraception?
Well, we'll talk about contraception too. You're right. We'll talk about contraception as well. And the church is teaching about that. We'll have to apply this to that area. Yeah. So, truth or lie? Yeah, it's a lie to each other. Willing the good or using? Using one another. Yeah. So we could look a little bit more. Why is premarital sex wrong? Well, I can list at least 5 reasons, 5 ways in which we can think about it. They're lying to each other with the language of their body, right? They are saying to each other through their body that they are married, and they are not. Like, I have given my whole self to you, but they haven't made that commitment, right? So they're lying to each other. Is that a good place to start a relationship? Lying to each other? No, not a good thing. You know. They are using each other. Yep, it's often more about pleasure because it's what we want to do now rather than let's wait for the commitment first and then express our love to each other in that way. Sex is meant to mirror the Holy Trinity, right? But this is not. They're saying, I prefer something else compared to imitating God's love. I want something else. So in a sense, you could say that sex outside of marriage is, in a sense, a message of defiance toward God. We will not mirror your love, Lord. We will do what we want. Do they know they're saying that? No. They don't realize that. But that's really what's happening. You could say it's adultery in advance, right? Adultery is having sex with somebody you're not married to. And that's what's happening here. You know, I will mention to couples that are living together and acting like married couples. It's like, so how do you know that you're going to be faithful to each other once in marriage? Because you're already having relations with someone you're not married with. You're already committing adultery before you're even married, right? So get them to think a little bit. It's two. You could think of it in terms of, you know, if you end up not getting married to this person and getting married to somebody else, you're regifting this gift of yourself, right? How many people like regifted things? Right? Right? In marriage, we want to give our whole self to one person. So we think about, wouldn't your future spouse deserve more than this, right? So in regard to this area, oftentimes too, one of the questions that will come up is, well, okay, how far can we go, before we get to a point in which we shouldn't be doing this? How far is too far? Oops. There we go.
How far is too far?
Wow!
Yeah.
This is a great view!
I bet it'd be greater if we got closer.
Okay. Wow!
Yeah. I bet it'd be wower if we got closer.
Okay. Oh, this is amazing! Hold me over the edge.
It's never felt like this before. Oops. Hi, Sarah. Hi, I was wondering if you want to come see the Grand Canyon with me. It's got a great view. How far is too far is really the wrong question to be asking, because it usually means, how much can I use this person without actually sinning? Any use is sinning. It shows that you don't care about giving love at all, but just taking physical pleasure. And the closer you get to whatever boundary you may have drawn, the more likely you are to fall. John Paul II said that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's use. Use goes beyond hate because it treats the other person as less than human. Is that really what you want to do to the person that you say you love? I don't think so. The better question to ask is, what can I do to truly love and respect this person? Because then any physical pleasure will really come from the love that it signifies. Hang on one second.
Thanks!
You're welcome.
For more Young Catholic Minutes, go to youngcatholicminute.com.
Or you can email us your questions at youngcatholic@ymail.com.
All right. So, one could also ask, how far do you want somebody else going with your future husband or wife? Or how far would you want someone else to go with your future child? All right. Finally, the good principle to follow is that sexual arousal belongs within marriage. So we need ultimately a change of heart. It gets into the virtue of chastity, right? How are we interiorly thinking about it? How far can I get them to go to God? How far can I go to guard their innocence? How do I show my real love to them? The poster over there is for a kind of an online organization called E5 Men, which stands for Ephesians chapter 5, which was the verse about husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so what it is basically it's a group of men who, and sometimes women will participate in it as well, is men choosing to fast once a month for their bride or future bride. So as a act of, acting against the tendencies of the world around us to use one another, but instead I'm going to sacrifice and do an act of love for my bride or future bride. So that's so we have some principles overall. We're going to get into, today we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll pick it up next time as well. But we can begin to go through a bunch of different things that the world has been very confused in this area. And the order in which I'm going to go through it is to kind of show us how we're basically, how did we get to where we're at? Things seem to have gone so wrong in so many different ways in our world around us. Is that how did we get to where we are? That sexuality really has become about self-expression and not about unity or procreation the way that God had designed it from the very beginning. And so there's various things that have occurred in our past, and that have led to these things. So various moments in which God's plan from the very beginning has been broken down and usurped. It goes all the way back to, it can go back to the fall, but some significant moments, especially within our own country. One moment is with regard to allowing no-fault divorce, which basically effectively removed the understanding that marriage is permanent. So it removed that from the cultural understanding of what marriage is. Of course, and that basically is true everywhere except for the Catholic Church now. Even in many Christian denominations, they have allowances for removing the permanence of the unitive meaning of marriage, right? And so that was kind of a doorstep that opened it up. This happened in 1969 when no-fault divorce was put into law in California, and then many states followed in the 1970s. And today, every state has no-fault divorce. Before that, law required that one partner be at fault in order for the couple to pursue the termination of their marriage, right? Which doesn't necessarily meet entirely up with, we don't expect the world to meet with Catholic theology, but the further we get away from God's original plan for marriage, we begin to see one step after another happening. So we're going to go through some of these other ones. What we see kind of next happen is contraception. Contraception becomes widely available in the 1960s, but even before that, we'll see contraception was okayed even by a lot of Christian churches going back into the 1930s, and that today, almost the only one that is opposed to it is the Catholic Church today. But we'll see contraception ends up removing, so no-fault divorce removes permanence from the meaning of marriage. Contraception removes the understanding that procreation is part of sex and marriage. As it goes through time, then we'll talk about abortion. Abortion ends up becoming so inundated into our culture because it becomes backup contraception. Contraception fails, you can abort the child afterwards, right? IVF, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, the fertility industry that we have in our society today, it removes the union of spouses from procreation. It separates those two completely from one another. As we go through time, same-sex relations, when those become normalized, it removes procreation and the need for biological complementarity from sex, right? So if sex has nothing to do with procreation, well then why do you need a biological complementarity of a man and a woman? Why can't you have same-sex, right? So one leads to the allowance of the next. That leads to same-sex marriage, right? So not only is, sex and procreation completely separate from one another, well then, procreation and marriage are completely separated from another, right? So you can, and as well as the complementarity, biological complementarity that would be needed for procreation should be removed. And that goes all the way down into where we're at today, right? Where the big thing that's happening now is the transgender stuff, right? So, which goes all the way to the denial of the integrity of the body and soul. But if sexuality has nothing to do with biological complementarity between men and women for the purposes of unity and procreation, well then why not? You can be whatever you want to be, right? So there's kind of, and who knows what the next step is going to be after that, right? There are already certain motions in some areas where, there's, individuals that try to normalize relations between adults and children and say that should be okay, right? But that's what happens when you lose sight of God's plan from the very beginning. The enemy begins to tear down and destroy one thing after another. So you may or may not see that right now, but as we go through, we're going to go through each of those things and see how they fail with regard to what the church teaches, and we'll see what happens in each of those. In each of these areas, I actually have much longer presentations that I actually, a lot of this is based on stuff that I did for my senior theology class, in which we would talk about theology of the body stuff, and then it was a faith and science class. So I would talk about all these things from both a faith and a science perspective. So I've cut out a lot of the science stuff from this because otherwise we wouldn't get through all these. We go through all these various things for an entire semester. So I can talk about a lot more details, but I got to cut it down quite a bit. So initially, let's just look at this and apply those characteristics first before we get into it. So free, total, faithful, fruitful, right? Can you see contraception, the use of contraception, failing in any of those 4 ways? Free, total, fruitful, definitely, right? So fruitful because that's in its very nature is what it's doing, right? It's trying to exclude the fruitfulness. Total, it excludes totalness because you're not giving your whole self, right? You're holding something back. Free, well, you could say in a sense we're not really, God hasn't given us the freedom to just do whatever we want, to redefine what marriage is all about.
You're holding back because you're afraid. You're not really giving of yourself because you're afraid of conceiving.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not really...
Yeah, you're not freely giving your whole self. Yeah. So ultimately, is it a truth or a lie? Lie. And that's the case even if it's used in marriage. Right? Even if it's utilized within marriage. So let's look at it a little bit here quickly before we finish. We should be able to get through just this part. So I mentioned the timeline already. So, prior to 1930, all Christian churches understood contraception as being wrong, as being contrary to God's law. But then, unfortunately, in 1930, the Anglican Church, they had their Lambeth Conference that broke the long-standing Christian tradition that contraception was immoral. And they said that they approved contraception for it to be used in marriage, and only for serious reasons. But in practice, what happened? You allow an exception, it became the rule, right? And so following the Anglicans, basically every other Christian church denomination followed suit. Yeah.
Can I ask, what kind of contraception was available in 1930?
Not the same ones that are today. Yes, you're right. That is, because that's true. Well, the church responded right away with a document called Casta Connubii, which reiterated the church's teaching, rejecting any kind of use of contraception. And then in 1968, so up to this point, you don't have very good contraceptives yet, right? So it doesn't really become widespread. And even in some states, it's illegal to utilize whatever there was because they were considered dangerous. And there's a lot of, many people still considered it to be immoral still. But then in the 60s, that's when the pill becomes available. And that becomes widespread. And that's when the church is forced to, once again, repeat what she'd always said. Prior to that, so in 1963, in the 60s then, debate starts happening within the Catholic Church about the teaching. And there were a lot of people within the Catholic Church who thought the church would now change her teaching on it, that she would allow the use of contraception. And there were some that even taught people, like there were even priests who taught couples that it was perfectly okay to utilize, right? But then in 1968, Pope Paul VI published his document Humana Vitae, on human life. And this reiterated the church's consistent prohibition against contraceptives, sterilization, and abortion, right? But he explained in a deeper way of why not, right? And so what's the church's teaching? The church's teaching that we find there in the Catechism, and it quotes Humana Vitae, every action which, whether in anticipation of the conjugal act, or in its accomplishment, or in the development of its natural consequences, purposes, whether as an end or as a means, to render procreation impossible, is intrinsically evil. So a lot of words there. But it's basically, there isn't any wiggle room. It's basically, in every case, if you're using it to render procreation impossible, that's an intrinsically evil action, right? It is never moral to use, is what it's saying. And Pope Paul VI, and what's true here is that it applies to every action. It doesn't just mean, because some people will ask, well, we're open to life because most of the time we renew our wedding vows, we're open to life. But sometimes we use contraception. But that's okay because most of the time we're open to life. So therefore, it's not making it impossible. But that's not what the church says. The church looks at sin is not, we don't think of this any other way with regard to other sins, right? We're like, well, I only murdered one person, so therefore I'm not a murderer. I'm okay in the rest of my time, right? Or I only did one lie. I don't lie every day. I only lie some of the time. Well, no, that's still a sin. So it's the same way in this. You can't say, well, most of the time we're open to life, and so therefore I can be not open to life some of the time. No, it's every individual action. No single act of conjugal love can be contracepted. Otherwise, that is a sinful action, right? And when people try to change that, they're trying to do kind of what Adam and Eve did. We kind of change what God has given to us and try to decide for ourselves what's good or bad, right? So, but there's been ways in which theologians and people have tried to get around the church's clear teaching on this. Pope Paul VI also predicted what would happen in our world if contraceptives became widespread. So he said that there would be greater infidelity and moral decline. What do you think? Has that happened? Yeah. It doesn't mean that all of this is only due to contraception, but that it would follow its use. What about loss of respect for women, treating them as objects? More or less of that now. No, it's plenty more. Abuse of power. The government would even utilize various means to force contraceptive means upon people. We find that in various places. You could think of one-child policy in China, which is now a two-child policy because they're realizing that was the worst thing for them that they did that, right? So there are unforeseen consequences when we start playing God in our life. But the United States did certain things in this area too. They did forced sterilization and things like that at various points to certain groups of people. Unlimited dominion, that we would then think that we can do whatever it is that we want. Do we see unlimited dominion in various with regard to technology and things that we think that we can do, right? We think we can even change who we are fundamentally from, men to women and back and forth. We can do all sorts of things now, right? So everything that he predicted would occur has indeed been a part of this kind of mentality because there is a mentality that arises with contraception. We'll see. That's attached to it. Another thing for us to consider with regard to this is medicine, because they'll say contraception is a form of medicine. Well, what is medicine? Now, think about what does it mean for something to be medicine? Well, it's the science and practice of the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease, so that we can either maintain or restore health by preventing and treating illness, right? So the question is, what disease is contraception treating? What disease is it treating? Well, the disease that they're treating is fertility. But that's not a disease, right? That's where it goes wrong, right? That's why contraception is not medicine. Because it's not actually it's not fixing something that's wrong. It's preventing something that is working proper from functioning that way, right? So fertility is not a disease. It treats something normal and healthy as if it were a disease, right? As if women who are fertile, there's something wrong with them, right? Because that's what the contraceptive pill, it is, women are the ones who have to have their bodies be changed by it, right? So it's using medicine to treat not a physical bodily problem, but a social problem. And but abortion also does the same kind of thing. We haven't talked about abortion yet, but so these are the reasons why abortion is done, and they're very similar to the reason why people use contraception, basically, right? So I don't want to have a child because it would dramatically change my life, or I can't afford to have a child. My relationships are not good right now, or I don't want to have any more children, right? None of those are physical bodily issues. They're all social and economic issues, right? So we're using medicine to treat a social economic issue rather than an actual medical issue. So it's not really medicine. It's basically the social problem of not wanting to have children, but wanting to have sex on demand without any consequences, right? So when a married couple uses contraception, their language of their body, of that action, is meant to be modeling their love after the love of God himself. But when they insert contraception into that, they are trying to change the meaning. They're lying to each other, and they're saying, I only give a part of myself to you, and I'll receive most of you, but not all of you, right? I won't give you my fertility. I won't accept yours. Or they're in a sense saying, I prefer this momentary act of pleasure rather than full communion with my spouse and the opportunity to participate in the life of love of the Trinity. Right? I'm choosing pleasure, not full communion with my spouse or God. Of course, the reality is that they don't know that's what they're saying. But that's what they're saying through the language of their body to each other, right? That they're saying, I reject you. So when I explain this, when I'm talking to couples that are using contraception, in marriage prep, and I explain this to them, I'm like, I'm not just, scolding you. I want your good, right? I want your happiness, and I want you to. I would want you to be able to participate in the very life of God himself when you do that as a married couple, right? That's what you can be saying to each other, right? And so when the church says no to contraception, does that mean that she says that couples now have to have like 30 kids? No. But what is it that they can utilize? Well, they can instead utilize natural family planning, right? It's not the old rhythm method, which basically assumed every single woman was exactly the same, and so they have exactly the same cycle. No, these are methods in which you actually pay attention to the biological indicators of the woman's naturally changing biological cycle, to pay attention to just how beautifully and wonderfully that she has been made, the way that God has made her, to pay attention to those indications, and it is just as effective, if not more so, than contraception. Because God has made us a certain way, is that there's certain times in which you might want to have a child and you will not be able to have one because biologically you can't, And other times, and so that's the beautiful thing here too, is that the method can be utilized to be able to prevent having a child for a good reason that a couple may have at the time, or to be able to achieve having a child. Of course, sometimes people might say, it's like, well, can a couple use natural family planning like contraception, to use it as a contraceptive method? I suppose they could use it for the wrong reasons. But the big difference between it, we'll see, is there's a big mental difference between the two of them. And that a couple is not going to be using it for selfish reasons very long. If they're either going to move away from the selfish reasons, or they're going to probably start using contraception to maintain the selfishness, because it can be much more difficult to utilize. But we'll see that even though it can be difficult, it's better for marriages. So anyway, we have, for example, the Pope Paul VI Institute in Omaha was named after Pope Paul VI, who wrote Humanae Vitae against contraception. And in his document, he called on doctors to help couples to be able to adhere to the way God has created us, but help them to be able to pay attention to the way God has created us, to be able to have the families that God would will them to. So Dr. Hilgers founded this in 1985. The clinic is in Omaha, and so he has a new approach compared to the world, which the world, will throw at issues. They'll throw contraception almost at every issue that a woman may have. And not only can it assist to help, prevent having a child or to attain having a child, it can also be used to try to help solve various other issues that could arise within reproductive health, right? So it pays attention to what's going on when oftentimes, let's say a woman is struggling with some kind of issues within reproductive health, they may go to the doctor and the doctor says, here's some contraception, because they'll use it to regulate the fertility cycle. But the moment, if she were to ever stop using it, all of the symptoms are going to come right back. So basically what it's done is to cover up the symptoms, but it doesn't actually address the underlying issue. Whereas what they'll do at that clinic is actually address the underlying things. And so I first learned about a lot of these things when I was in the seminary, and they actually had individuals come and talk to us. And I've heard Dr. Hilgers give and talk before, and so it's what comes to my mind is just how like disrespectful that the normal way that doctors would do. I mean, if you're coming into a doctor, you'd want the doctor to actually solve the problem, right? You don't want them just to cover it up. But that's what they were doing to women. They're just, here, take this. We're not actually going to try to solve the issue. We'll just cover it up. Oh, and by the way, you won't be able to get pregnant either. So, but that's part of the mental attitude of our society that rejects children today in many ways, right? It's the contraceptive mentality. So, to quickly end here, so natural family planning. So it's kind of interesting. We had a few different natural family planning representatives come and talk to us as seminarians, so we learned more about these things. And it was kind of funny that they kind of are. They don't always get along with each other, because I asked one question to them one of the times. This is like what the difference was between. Because they sound so similar to each other. They didn't really like that question, but. They will often tell couples about how great it is, but they won't often mention that it isn't easy. You know, that it does require work. It's hard. You know, contraception is tempting because it sounds so easy, and those who use NFP often have a hard time. And I'm not denying that. I know that couples will struggle in this area to follow God's. They know what they should do, but it's not always easy to do. I mean, but it's not as though couples who have contraception have perfect marriages. You know, the problem ultimately is we live in a fallen world. You know, we're fallen human beings. It's the fact that, guess what? You married an imperfect person. You know, not because of the specifics here. So NFP is difficult because it leads a couple to have to overcome their own selfishness, right? So, very interesting book written by a woman, Simca Fisher, who describes the sinner's guide to natural family planning. Right? There's one chapter in there that's entitled "The Worst Possible System," referring to NFP. The worst possible system, except for all the others. Right. So it's got some humor in there to laugh about things. But if we look at it, there is a significant difference between the two. Contraception, you know, once a couple decides they're going to use contraception, they don't really have to talk about it anymore. Right? They're just using it. Whereas if you're going to use natural family planning, you got to constantly be talking about, you know, why are we deciding to not renew our wedding vows right now? Because, I mean, built into the system is that you have to abstain during the times that, you know, you could have a child, right? So you got to continue to have a conversation. You know, why are we not having a child now? Maybe we should. Are we at a point now in our life where God's calling us to have a child now? So you got to, which is better for marriage?
You're asking which is better?
Yeah, which one would be those two things would be better? Yeah, having to engage in conversation, right? That's good for marriage, to have to talk to each other about stuff, especially something as important as this, right? Contraception, I mentioned already, it tends to be disrespectful, especially towards the woman. It basically assumes something's wrong with her. You know, God's created her defectively, and so we need something to fix her. You know, and I didn't get into all the science, but all of the chemicals that she can be exposed to and the negative side effects, and there's a lot of even secular areas that are recognizing the negative side effects of chemical contraceptives, versus natural family planning, which is respectful of the way God has created the husband and wife. So which one's better for them? NFP. Yeah. Contraceptive, interestingly, it basically has to trick the woman's body into thinking that it's pregnant, right? And so it's like, so a woman's body is supposed to be pregnant during the 9 months of pregnancy. I'm not a medical doctor, but I wouldn't think that it's probably healthy for her body to think that it's in a perpetual state of pregnancy. It's probably not all that healthy. I can't say for sure, I'm not a medical doctor, but it seems to reason that it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But spontaneity, you know, if we use contraceptives, that means we can renew our wedding vows whenever we want, right? We don't have to think about the consequences. But with natural family planning, it's more about creativity. When you're not you have to have times which you're not engaging in sexual intercourse. So therefore, you have to come up with other more creative ways to express your love with one another, right? Which could be much better for marriage, because I mean you should be able to express love in more than one way, right? Marriage is not a perpetual renewing one's wedding vows at every moment. There's many other things within marriage. Contraception doesn't really have to, you don't have to really develop any kind of self-discipline to use it. Whereas natural family planning, you do, because you have to say no to what you want to do at that point, right? I really want to renew my wedding vows, but we have a good reason not to, right? Which one makes for better marriage? I mean, growing in virtue, right? Becoming more self-disciplined. If you grow in this area, hopefully you're also growing in other areas too, right? So natural family planning is better for marriage, but we don't deny it's more difficult. And it is more difficult because it's better for marriage, because we're fallen human beings and we need to grow in virtue. Sorry, this is the last one and we'll stop. So this is a quote from Dr. Jérôme Lejeune. He's venerable now. He died in 1994. He was a French geneticist who discovered chromosome 21 that causes Down syndrome. So he's a very strong pro-life Catholic doctor, and when they wanted to start using his medical research to identify unborn children with Down syndrome so that they would be terminated, they'd be aborted, he was strongly against that. And in 1969, he was given this prestigious William Allen Award. And so he gave a speech at that against abortion. And after he gave his speech and sat down with his wife, he told her, "Today I have lost my Nobel Prize in medicine." Yeah, and he never got it. Even though his research, he was basically up for, and people were telling him he would get it for his research, with regard to Down syndrome. So he became the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life in 1994, a month before he died. And then he died. He's been declared venerable. He was declared venerable in 2021. So that's one of the first steps. So venerable, an eventual way to be canonized a saint. So hopefully he's canonized a saint at some point. But so he said that contraception is to make love without a child, right? So you're separating the unitive and the procreative ends of marriage, right? And we'll get into the next ones, what he said about these other issues too. But so we'll look at those next. So we can see here that we're at the point of contraception, and then we'll start next time by talking about abortion, the next step, where abortion becomes the backup of contraception.